Oh, that's bullshit.
Kyle, there are children here. Welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle. Today we're going to be talking about the election proper, and also we're going to talk about the COMELEC, the voters, how it affected the candidates, etc. So just a brief overview for our series so far. In the first episode, we talked about like a general overview of what's at stake and how the elections work. In the second episode, we talked about how we had an interview with our good friends Nathan and Bianca about what happened during the campaign. In this episode, again, we're going to talk about the election, and then after this, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the election.
Yeah, so even in the first episode, we already went through like the candidates, who they are, what they can contribute or not contribute, and basically we've kind of already been foreshadowing that we're not in a good situation right now. So we'll make you even sadder by talking about what happened during election day, which had so much controversy around it. For this series, or this episode rather, we want to discuss three important things, like what were the candidates doing, what was COMELEC doing, what were the voters doing. Because even in each of these actors, there are so many issues and so many debatable topics that at this point, I don't know if it will still be relevant for debating. Because no one really has made a motion in regard to this. And the sad thing really about Filipinos and our attention span as humans in general is this was a huge controversy 2 months ago, but I don't see much clamor for it anymore. Like people have just kind of accepted that so many things went wrong, right? It's ridiculous.
And also, I think for like the debate community, a lot of the time we're so afraid of for example, setting or debating motions that like we only know a little bit about. Like, for example, we're probably going to be willing to debate about the COMELEC, but very, very little of us will know what the COMELEC is, what are its powers, etc.
Yeah.
So, we have sort of like a surface level knowledge of everything at this point because we consume things through like tweets or what, but, or maybe even news stories, but those news stories don't really delve into the specifics of why things work the way they do.
Yeah. And I think it's also hard to have debates about them because you need knowledge of the law, you need knowledge of like for example, the specific departments of COMELEC and what they do. So, like I was AdCore for PIDC recently, and a lot of us wanted to have an election-based motion. But on one hand, we knew that there was so much like stuff still unresolved, still hard to debate about. So I think a lot of the motions we made in relation to elections were also surface level, right? And it's not because we couldn't think of motions, but because we wanted to make them as accessible as possible. And a lot of the topics we were thinking of were too technical. Really.
Too technical, yeah.
Yeah. You need like
for example, I was expecting something about the party list system and how. Well, to be fair, a party list system motion did come out.
Yeah.
But what I was expecting was that, like, the parties in the party list system were only for like the marginalized sectors or whatever. Because right now you have sectoral and non-sectoral parties in party system, and a reason why that didn't come out or something was that it was too technical. Because you needed to know what the House of Representatives was composed of, how they compute for like which party lists get which seats and stuff.
And it's also, you need to know like what article in the Constitution has the specific info for the legislative.
Article 6.
Yeah, Article 6. So you needed to know what was specifically written in Article 6. Though we did make a motion about it, close to it.
Yeah,
the one about how candidates need to be from the sector that they're representing. But if you notice, that didn't really touch on the elections itself. It was more of the campaign still. For the elections itself, there were so many things that went wrong. So the first part I think that we should talk about are the candidates. Like what was going wrong outside of the precincts. And I think there were two things. Like there was vote buying And even Duterte himself said that it's a Philippine culture to vote by, which I think is ridiculous. But as much as he was condemned for that statement, again, we condemn Duterte for so many statements, but nothing ever happens, does it? So there was vote buying, and there were a lot of precincts that reported instances of vote buying. But how do you even legislate against those? Like, we have laws against them, obviously.
Yeah,
but
we
why
do.
aren't they implemented rather well?
In order for you to implement them, like, the first question is who gets to implement them? And the answer is the COMELEC. Because the COMELEC has original and exclusive jurisdiction over all election-related offenses. So, vote buying, in order for the laws against vote buying to be enforced, there's quite a bit of bureaucracy. You need to have law enforcement be deputized by the COMELEC first. And then, like, COMELEC has to investigate everything. But sometimes it's very difficult to ascertain, like, the truth of a lot of rumors of vote buying. Because, like, the biggest problem in, like, criminal prosecution for these types of things is what you can prove. So, can you really prove that this person committed vote buying? Was it authorized, for example, by the politician doing the vote buying? So, there are certain elements which makes it tricky for anyone to bring up a case of vote buying to the COMELEC.
Yeah, so even this topic, see, it's so technical.
Yeah.
Like, lots of people wouldn't know that it's the COMELEC that gives jurisdiction to other parties to prosecute. No one knows, like, who can be put into jail for vote buying. What if you're just someone who got money? Are you liable in any way? No.
I don't think so.
Right, so that makes things more complicated.
Yeah,
Because
I'm not sure actually.
Yeah, what's the disincentive for me to get money if I know I can get away with it? Like, if I'm not gonna be the one in trouble. That's why vote buying has become a culture. Also surprising is, even if Duterte made that statement, COMELEC didn't react to it, did it? It didn't release a counter statement, they didn't release a clarification. Everyone just kind of shrugged and was like, yeah, vote buying.
Yeah, I mean, there could be, like, an election protest to say that we have to exclude, like, certain votes from the overall tally because, like, those votes have been corrupted or whatever. Because in the past, COMELEC has done so.
Oh.
Yeah. In a few cases. It's actually a very, like, weird issue. And I feel like we can talk about that more in the next part about the COMELEC.
Yeah.
What the COMELEC has authority to do and not do.
Yeah. Besides vote buying, though, there's also an issue of vote trading, which is very common. And I don't think this one's illegal because this is basically lobbying. So you ask your local governments to support your national candidate. In return, they're likely going to put some pork into your pocket. They're going to help in more projects in the local government areas, which is why a lot of the bigger politicians had so much more support from local government units, right? Because they had the ability to campaign there. I think another more interesting one is the INC. So they're the biggest example of vote trading. I'm not sure exactly what candidates trade, because I'm pretty sure the way the INC works is before they endorse a candidate as a whole or as a block, obviously candidates campaign to them. They lobby to them, right? It's like who can bid the most for the votes of millions. Right?
Oh yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, I don't think it's cool though in a whole democracy sense. It's cool in the fact that, it actually happens.
Well, you said it's like lobbying, so is it any less legitimate than any other forms of lobbying?
Well, I wanted to make a motion actually about block voting, but I didn't know how to word it.
Yeah,
for example,
me
like how
neither.
can
Like,
you go against block voting? Isn't that their right as a religion?
I was thinking like a religion angle to it. Like, can the state intervene in their freedom of religion if their freedom of religion is the only reason why they're interfering in politics? So there's a secularism angle there, but I'm not sure how to word it.
Yeah. But at this point, like, the INC has always been a big issue in every single election. But notice how we've sort of just accepted it as culture as well. Like, we even report about it. Like, the INC has officially announced who their block vote is going to. And the media treats it so normal. But I'm not sure if it should be normal.
I'm still thinking of the, like, can the state intervene thing? Because, like, if you remember before, I was saying that the state can only interfere with the freedom of religion if there's a compelling state interest. And what if the integrity of the election is the compelling state interest? So the state can intervene. But the problem there is, if the state intervenes, infringe upon people who are actually going to vote for these people anyway, regardless of what, And there are lots of INC people who don't follow the block vote anyway. So, like, it's just really hard to word as a motion.
Yeah. But at the same time, we don't really know the perspective of the INC. Like, neither of us are INC.
Yeah.
So, honestly, I feel uncomfortable trying to, like, guess their situation from the inside. Though there have been tweets and threads that I've been seeing about how people want to go against the block vote. But I heard that there could be punishments for them within INC if they don't. But at the same time, I wonder, how will they even know what you vote for, right?
I'm actually not sure.
Yeah.
But then again, that's why the secrecy of a ballot is an important thing.
Yeah. But it doesn't seem to be a secret for INC members. Do they all gather and tell each other who they voted for, right?
I actually don't know.
Right? I don't know. So that's a complex issue.
But I did hear that if you disobey, for example, what the INC tells you to do, and it becomes like knowledge, it like they find out about it, the punishment isn't like physical or whatever. It's more of like social isolation. So I had a friend once who didn't follow the block vote, and people found out, and also they supported the RH bill and stuff, and the rest of his family members found out about it and started like dumping on him like in private conversations, etc. So he felt alone.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah.
But sadly, we can't do. So that's like the biggest issue with elections, is that there are so many small details to it that we probably should regulate, but we can't regulate. Because there are bigger issues that we also need to regulate. Understand? It's like, there's so many holes in our constitution regarding how elections are run, even how certain bodies work. And the fact that people can find loopholes makes it so much harder to maneuver around these issues. Which brings us, I think, to the discussion of COMELEC. Because if anything, they should be the body that we are most capable of regulating. Because they're the basic central hub of everything elections.
The COMELEC is an independent,
quote unquote independent.
An independent constitutional creation. And it has a few functions. So it's executive, and its function in administering the election and enforcing like good like a fair, honest elections. But it's also quasi-legislative because it provides all the guidelines that everyone else has to follow for getting those elections, and it's also quasi-judicial because, as I said, it has exclusive and original jurisdiction over election-related cases and election protests. So, the first thing you need to know about the COMELEC is like its powers, and you can check that in Article 9C of our current constitution, because there's Section 2 of Article 9C. It's just like a really long list of what it can and can't do.
Wow.
Yeah, so for example, it can determine so many things during the election, but the exception is the right to vote. So it can determine the validity of like so many things except for questions regarding the right to vote. And the problem here was that in the past, the court was sort of trying to decide how to interpret this. On one hand, the Constitution explicitly states that the COMELEC cannot interfere with anybody's right to vote. On the other hand, the Constitution also says that they're there to enforce free, honest, and fair elections. So, there were cases in the past about whether or not they can exclude certain votes from the overall tally, which I said earlier. And the court held that they could. There was a case, Nationalista Party versus COMELEC. The court held that you can't just annul an election because that would mean you're interfering with the right to vote. But future jurisprudence said that you can exclude some votes on the basis of fraud, etc. So the first thing is that it has the power to not annul complete elections, but to exclude certain portions of the voter base in order to ensure the integrity of the elections as a whole. But I don't think it's applicable right now because you can't just exclude like one precinct. Can you? Do you think we can exclude just the results from one precinct? But like it's all in the same system. If you exclude the results of one precinct, doesn't that mean you're also invalidating the integrity of the rest of the system?
Yeah, or the precincts next to it. For example, if there's a case of vote buying and you're sure it's from that one precinct, how are you sure that the people who bought votes there didn't go to other precincts, right?
Yeah. And I remember during in 2016, there are people who were saying, "Oh, the machines are all broken," stuff. Like we're feeding votes to Lenny.
Yeah.
And like a response many of us had was that you can't just say that because if the machines were all broken and there's no integrity in the elections
for the vice president,
this is the same like integrity that's violated in for the president, etc.
Like all other ones you voted for. Like it's hard to create a hack that only hacks for the vice president and not the others, right? So that's like the technical aspect. So basically, the takeaway here is if the COMELEC works well, then the elections work well. But if they don't, then the elections become questionable.
Oh, so someone also asked like, isn't this a failure of election? And while it may seem that way, that it's a failure of elections, it's really hard for you to declare that there's a failure of elections.
But wait, before we talk about the failure of elections and if it is one, you have to tell them what happened first.
Alright, you're right.
So this is like a bunch of matter dump right now for what went wrong in the elections. If you aren't aware of all these specifics, I've listed them down. So the first would be there have been certain reports of VCMCs that were pre-opened, so the counting machines. There's a rule that says that they can't open it until the day of the elections to avoid any tampering, etc. But there are a lot of machines that have been opened, have been checked up on. So people argued, or the people in the precincts, like the COMELEC, what do you call them? They're volunteers, right? The people who work in the precincts.
Poll watchers.
Yeah, the poll watchers. They said that, they were just checking up, but the opening in itself is sketchy because you could do a lot of things with the machine. You could hack it, you could manipulate it, etc. Right? Obviously, the machine should be designed to be against those, but as a safety precaution, you have to keep them closed. So the first scandal was that there were a lot of machines that were open prior. The second scandal was that around 1,000 SD cards malfunctioned. And 1,000 is a big number because back in 2016, only 120 malfunctioned, which is kind of questionable. How do you get a corrupt SD card which hasn't been used yet? We're assuming all of these SD cards are new. And what I heard was that this was a lower budget sort of SD card. Yeah. Because before, companies have to bid for who can handle the elections. Yeah, so this is another technical aspect of it. But what happened this year is to cut costs. They allowed companies to bid for individual parts of the machine. So one company won the bid for the SD cards. One company won the bid for who would supply the pens. One company won in terms of what kind of paper we'll be using. Right? So all of them, it's harder now to pinpoint accountability if you have so many different companies that were in charge of different parts of the machines and the voting proper.
And that's the reason why a lot of the pens that they used were not good. So they blotted the following page.
Yeah. So that's the third scandal. Like a lot of the pens were faulty, and therefore a lot of the votes weren't being able to cast. So besides the pen being faulty, there's also the issue of the malfunctioning machines. So Judge Omar Binay's ballot, for example, was not accepted. I'm not sure if he was allowed to recast his vote, but what I know is if you mess up your ballot through blotty pen, or maybe you shade it outside the line, then that's it. You don't get a revote, right?
Yung kay Binay ata, it was because of the machine.
The machine itself.
More than the pen. Yeah. Like, what happened was, hindi ata naka-upload sa machine yung... Like, the machine, couldn't recognize Binay's ballot or something.
Yeah, but still, it's just another scandal. Or how some machines malfunction in different ways. So there are some people, you get a receipt after you cast your vote, just to sort of double check.
Yeah, tas dun sa receipt, nakalagay na daw yung bongo.
Yeah, like there were so many people who voted for bongo even if they didn't shade him. So people are suspecting that the machine made it such that if you left bongo blank, it will automatically like shaded. If you don't have like 12 senators shaded already.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how they will do that. Another malfunctioning machine issue was that in Valle Verde, Pasig, one of the precincts had to handwrite all the votes because the machine was not working, was not reading the electronic ballots, and the line was getting long. So the poll watchers decided they would just let the people write their votes down and they would shade the ballot for them later on and feed it to machine.
Oh, that's bullshit.
Hey, I'm gonna censor that bad word out.
Oh, okay.
Kyle, there are children here.
Alright, so what was the reason for all the malfunctions? So on one hand, it could be tampering,
Yeah.
but on another hand,
Could be just
it
the
could
fact
be
that
like
it's cheap.
yeah, it's
Because
cheap.
of the SD cards as well.
Yeah, so a debatable topic here is like, what are we gonna do with the Procurement Act? Because there is a law that prescribes how to do it, and the reason for that is because like you have a bare minimum, and the state wants to get that bare minimum at the lowest cost possible.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to waste taxpayers' money, right? You want to make sure that there's enough for everyone else. But that's exactly the reason why, like, no company is incentivized to go beyond the bare minimum.
Yeah.
Because they're working for as cheap as possible.
Yeah. So these were issues that happened in the morning. But we're not done yet. After all these malfunctions that were happening in the morning, actually throughout the whole day until 6 p.m., right? Because that's the cutoff of voting. There were also now issues of what happened when they started counting the votes. So there were a lot of delays in the release of results. And one of the main reasons for that could be that it's malfunctioning. Another would be that there's no transparency at all for COMELEC this year. They usually have NAMFREL to sort of be a second body to check and balance the COMELEC. Because as much as we trust the COMELEC, we also have the NAMFREL, which is the National Citizens Movement for Free Elections. So they're an NGO that looks after the COMELEC. So if the COMELEC is independent, then this NGO is full of concerned citizens who want to ensure that COMELEC is doing the job. But NAMFREL wasn't really given a big role this year. In previous elections, what they do is they counter-check the votes. Right, so once COMELEC calculates votes, they pass it on to NAMFREL, which calculates votes, and then it gets to the media. But here they wanted to make it direct because they trusted electronics so much.
They had a transparency server. Yeah.
They had a transparency server. And the transparency server promised media outlets that it would release updates every 10 to 15 minutes. And it worked for the first, 2 cycles. But then there was
naging 90%.
Yeah, and then it jumped to 90% because there was a 7-hour gap. So we don't know what happened between those 7 hours because it jumped from 0.37% of the results to 90.57. That's a huge jump, and we don't know what happened. And there are lots of threads on Twitter ranting about this. There were speculations and rumors. Again, this is just what I heard. I'm not saying this is fact, and I'm saying this with a lot of disclaimers. There were rumors that there could have been lobbying between the 7 hours. There was a rumor that COMELEC was allowing candidates to vote by from them directly, and they would manipulate results. I'm not sure how true this is, but given the 7-hour gap, the fact that it's plausible just makes it scary. We don't know what happens in those 7 hours.
But I think it might also be likely that the transparency server had a malfunction or something. The Wi-Fi was bad.
Yeah, but the thing is, COMELEC didn't say anything for those 7 hours. If there was an error in the transparency server, don't you think they should have released a statement immediately after the 3rd cycle wasn't done? But they didn't. And that's the issue. There was literally no comment from the COMELEC. The only comment they made was afterwards in saying that, the transparency server is back. Here you go. Here are 90% of the results. Take it or leave it. Right? So many people complain. And then after the 90% was released, the next morning, it reverted back to 37%. So what happened? They recounted. But it's weird, all the jumps in percentages. And this is the most controversial election I've gotten to witness. Or probably because
How many elections have you witnessed?
I mean, all the recent elections have been electronic, and there have been issues for all of them. But you'd assume that through the years we'd get better at it. But here it's we're acting like it's our first time using the electronic ballot system again, right? So there was no comment. Second is, the COMELEC had the audacity to claim that there was no election failure despite all this. But again, as Kyle mentioned, they're technically right, which I hate.
So
I hate it.
Yeah, so a failure of election doesn't just happen from like fraud or force majeure or something, because the Omnibus Election Code specifically like gives only 3 grounds for failure of election. The first one is that like no election took place on the date provided. The second one is that you suspended the election like on that date, and also if like there are precincts that after the election happened there was a failure to elect. So like the bad things that Nina just talked about earlier, while they're bad, they're not in themselves reasons to declare a failure of election. Those like bad things that happened should have led to like not having the election at all, suspending the election, or a failure to elect in some precincts. So the burden of proof isn't just to say that bad things happened during the election. In order to have it declared to be a failure of election, you need to say why all these different bad things led to no elections happening at all, or a failure to elect. And so that's a problem with a failure of elections. It's extremely difficult to do that. So I remember a case, I think it's Borjal versus COMELEC, where the court basically said like, yeah, you did give us a lot of these anomalies, but you never proved in your petition, or allege even in the petition, that any of these circumstances led to any of the 3 grounds in the Omnibus Election Code.
Yeah. So we don't know if there's actually a case being filed against COMELEC right now. Probably there isn't, which makes me sad. But if there was, I think that it's going to be an uphill battle. So basically, the sad thing is, as we're discussing this, like, I'd assume by now there was something done. But it's been 2 months since the elections, and nada. We just had to accept that all these failures happened. There was no closure at all, no explanation whatsoever. Maybe people on the inside have the sufficient closure and explanation, but I don't think media has been covering it much lately.
Oh, there was also this thing about Duterte Youth. Remember, like the C. Cardema, and he isn't a member, like he isn't technically a member of the youth, pero nagpa-substitute siya. So how that works is, these parties can have substitutions, candidates can have substitutions, but only until a particular point in time.
Yeah.
And when that happens, dapat fit pa rin siya dun sa standards
Isn't
of being a
youth,
member of...
like, until 40 years old, right? Isn't that usually
Isn't it 30?
I know some youth charters that have people until 40.
Yeah, so that's a legal question pa.
Yeah.
Like, but... So that's one problem. The other problem is, with the case of Cardema, the substitution happened the day before the election happened.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's supposed to be an invalid substitution, but the COMELEC told the media that his application for substitution is going to, like, we're gonna
Expedite?
give it due course.
Oh.
Due course. And lots of people thought, especially the media at first, thought that that was the COMELEC like allowing the substitution to happen. And that was a big deal. But really, they were just saying that we're accepting the application, we're gonna say whether or not it's invalid in a future time. Because what happens is, by law, COMELEC is mandated to accept every application for substitution and act upon them, like, and put them through due course. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's already processed. So the COMELEC accepted the application, but it doesn't mean that it said that the substitution was valid.
That's so technical. Not laymen wouldn't be able to understand the difference of that.
No, I think it's a problem with the terms that they used, because technically it's correct to say that they're gonna like do due course on it. But normal people hear that and say, oh, that means they already approved it.
Yeah.
But the process of approving the application for substitution and this are completely different.
Yeah. So the last part, I think, is after discussing all the failures of Comelec, quote-unquote failures, I can't say that because it technically didn't fail according to the Constitution and according to their laws and rules. There's also a big issue with the voters themselves. The youth sector was expected to change the results of this year because there were a lot of new registrants for who can vote, right? So they're expecting a lot of the youth to sort of salvage or become a wild card for these elections. Luckily for politicians and sadly for us, it didn't make that big of an impact. It did in local governments, right? But we're not going to discuss those. I think for now, I want to talk more at the national level. In local governments, there are a lot of dynasties that were overturned, right? Okay, there's a good article by Claire Yao about the political dynasties that were overthrown and the other political dynasties that stayed in place after the results of this election. So I think it's interesting to check that out. But what I want to focus more on are the issue of non-voters. You notice how there are so many people online getting mad at people who are not voting and saying that all the bad things that happen in these elections is because of your ignorance and negligence. But at the same time, my personal thoughts on it would be, I don't think we should punish people who choose not to vote because there are certain instances where it's still the government's fault that they're not able to vote. For example, maybe they just don't feel that big of a connection with their government right now because they don't feel any of what the government is doing matters to their lives. Or for example, maybe it's a technical thing. Maybe applying for a voter's registration is too complex. It's too inaccessible. Like the bureaucracy of it is so hard. For example, when I moved, when I had to move precincts because I lived in Manila and then I moved to QC, there was so much paperwork just for me to like transfer my residency. There were a certain point in time where I was just like, I don't want to do this anymore. It's so much hassle.
Yeah, so
I had to go back.
I actually know so many people for both of those causes. So, I have a relative who didn't vote at all this year. I'm like, why didn't you vote? Sabi niya, because he doesn't have faith in the system at all.
Yeah.
So, and I remember an episode of Always Sunny in Philadelphia where they were talking about not voting.
Yeah.
And then one of the characters said, it's a pointless exercise. You're just gonna pick between a politician that will blast you in the ass or another politician will also blast you in the ass.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of people don't have that. And what we have a technical term for it. I've done so many papers on this. It's called political efficacy. So political efficacy is how much you feel like you're able to contribute to politics and how much you think politicians are able to contribute to your life. So the higher your political efficacy, the higher your attachment to politics is. And
therefore also your
likelihood
of participation,
Yeah. So, but then if you have no political efficacy, which is a big problem here in the Philippines, you're not likely to feel like your vote is relevant or important, etc. So there's issues here on how much accountability do we give those who don't vote? How about those who voted maliciously? Or were they malicious in their vote? So if they voted for Duterte's allies, or were they just naive? Are they victims of campaigns, or should we make them accountable because they make the wrong choices? Right? I think that's
in the previous episode we were talking about this, right?
Yeah.
Like we shouldn't be so mad at the people who voted for Duterte's allies
because they have
their own reasons.
Yeah.
And similarly, there are many reasons why people choose not to vote.
Yeah. So I think that's basically it, right? So during the elections itself, so much went on with the candidates and their vote buying. So much went on with Comelec and all their mishaps in their office and in their precincts. And lastly, even voters who feel like the combination of the candidates and Comelec make it less likely for them to want to vote in the first place. So if they all affect each other, which is horrible, and because they affect each other, it becomes harder to fix it. So why did we talk so much about all this, Kyle? What's the point of all of this? It seems like we're doomed.
But I don't think we're doomed. Well, I think that we're at a very rough spot though.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need to do is to learn about all the places where we went wrong.
Yeah.
So like we can possibly learn from it. Definitely learn from it the next time around.
Yeah.
And also like I think that it's just important for us to talk about it so that we sort of shed light as to people about what went wrong.
Yeah, so I guess in this episode, we're not really prescribing a course of action because we don't know ourselves. But I think the first step is to make everyone aware of what things need actions placed on them. So we need a lot of work. Hopefully, if we all pitch in together, we'll be able to do something.
This was a long episode.
Yeah, but I think it was important to delve into all these details. I didn't know a lot of the things until you just mentioned them now. So, thanks, Kyle.
Wow.
My law person. Yeah, so I think that's it for this episode. Not really the fun episode, is it? It's kind of gloomy. It kind of makes me sad. But, it can't all be fun times if we're talking about things that are important to the country.
I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, because you got to do a lot of talking about the law. I mean, it's interesting. It's just sad. That's all I'm saying. So again, thanks for listening to this episode of Debatable. I'm Nina.
I'm Kyle.
We'll see you in the next one where we talk about the aftermath. Hopefully not as gloomy, but probably more gloomy than this episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.